What's up, guys? It is your boy SamonFan101, and today we're going to be reviewing the second Avengers film, Avengers Age of Ultron. Now, this film was, of course, the sequel to the very highly successful Avengers film back in 2012. This was released in May of 2015. Once again, it was directed and written by Joss Whedon. And this would end up being the last film that Joss Whedon would ever work on with the MCU, or should I say the last Avengers film, as after this, the title of Avengers or Avengers-related or Avengers-style films would go on to the Russo brothers, who of course previously directed Captain America: Winter Soldier. Now, so there's not really a whole lot of backstory to this. It's just, you know, some of the same stuff. So let's get into the. Well, might as well get into the gross. The budget the gross budget was $444 to $495 million, though the net budget was way lower with $365. Clearly, this film had a huge ass budget, probably with the amount of a lot more casting and probably the higher pay rate for said budget. This film made $1.4 billion, just shy, a little under the $1.5 billion that Avengers made. But, so yeah, so let's get into it. I don't know where that came from. What's the plot of this film? Well, we start out almost immediately with an action sequence. This, of course, takes place in 2015, current day. We start out with an action sequence in a country called Sokovia, where the Avengers, of course that being Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, Hawkeye, the Hulk, and Black Widow, raid the Hydra facility that is being not guarded, but is being commanded. Being basically the top guy there was a guy called Baron von Strucker. Now, of course, if you recall the ending of Captain America: Winter Soldier, we saw Strucker and the two twins, that being the Maximoff twins, a Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, and we know that due to his own words, he fed foreign Hydra facilities to the Avengers so they could keep their tracks hidden while they experiment on Loki's staff from the first film. Or not staff, but scepter. It's technically a scepter. And not only that, but they're also working on technology left over from the Avengers by the Chitauri. So basically, the beginning of this film is dealing with the remnants of the Chitauri and Hydra left over from the Avengers and Captain America: Winter Soldier. Which, the only film that events are ever referenced or even alluded to in this movie really is Captain America: Winter Soldier. None of the events are mentioned of Iron Man 3. None of the events are mentioned of Thor: The Dark World, except for a brief glimpse of the ether. And none of the events are mentioned. And for Guardians of the Galaxy, though, to be fair, that's far off in space. I expect that to be like that. Winter Soldier is really the only one that has any real, not basis in continuity, but any real impact because of the whole Hydra thing. So I just thought that was a nice little thing. They invade the facility. They come across Scarlet Witch and Black Widow, who are named Scarlet Witch and Black Widow. Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, who are Wanda and Pietro Maximoff, respectively. And while Strucker is taken a prisoner, and the facility is pretty much taken, Scarlet Witch uses her manipulation abilities to basically look into the fears of Tony Stark's mind, which allows him to make a dumb choice in a few minutes. So basically, after they take the facility, they take Loki's scepter, which they also captured, back to Stark Tower, which was back to Avengers Tower, which was previously Stark Tower in the first Avengers movie. That has since been, remodeled. And both Stark and Bruce Banner have been working on an artificial intelligence called Ultron, which is their global defense program that they wanted to create. And with the scepter in their hands, and with the gem that's within the scepter, they basically go on for the next 3 days to try to create Ultron through the intellectual matter that's within the scepter's gem. They don't succeed, but for some reason that's never really explained, Ultron somehow activates, and after looking into the information through his connection through the internet, basically through the web, the World Wide Web, basically, he comes to the conclusion that he must destroy all human beings on Earth in order to save the planet. Basically, he wants to. Well, I'll get to that a little bit later. He destroys Stark's AI, Jarvis, who, basically he tries to kill Jarvis. Jarvis seemingly dead, and using the Iron Legionnaires that Tony Stark built in order to help keep the peace with the civilian, trying to get them to safety. One of them escapes with Loki's scepter, and now they have to go find it again. Ultron comes after building a newer, more Ultron-ish looking body. He comes across the Maximoff twins, and they begin a partnership. After doing that, they go to a guy named Ulysses Klaue, who in this film is played by the great Andy Serkis. Ulysses Klaue is basically an old black market arms dealer that has been known to stealing vibranium out of the country of Wakanda, which of course is where vibranium comes from, and is also the substance in which created Captain America's trademark shield. The Avengers eventually figure this out, and they go to try to stop them, but Scarlet Witch basically manipulates all their minds, all except for Tony, who she already did earlier in the film, and Hawkeye, who straight up mentioned he was manipulated in the first film. He's not a fan, and he basically put her ass to sleep. Or at least, maybe not put her ass to sleep, because she did go and infect the Hulk. But basically he defended himself, is what I'm trying to say. So yeah. By the way, because Ultron, because of his creation, now has some sort of obsession with Tony Stark. And when Ulysses compared something he said to Iron Man and said if he was one of Iron Man's creations, he straight up cut off his arm, because Ultron is a dick like that. Now, with that being said, we go back to the Hulk, who, like I said, was infected by Scarlet Witch, and basically he goes on a complete rampage. He goes fucking ballistic. And if there ever was a version of the Hulk that just wanted to destroy everything in his path, the Hulk was it. Tony fights him through using the Hulk Buster, which he and Banner created should the Hulk ever run amok, which apparently happened here. Through a very good fight scene, Tony Stark is able to basically knock Hulk out, essentially turning him back to Banner. And Hawkeye apparently takes everyone back to his home, which he reveals that he has a wife as well as two kids with a third on the way. There in basically the cabin out in the open spaces of nature, the Avengers try to figure out what the hell's going on. Thor breaks off to try to find some answers, and thanks to Nick Fury coming in, they regroup to try to figure out what Ultron's plan is, and that Ultron doesn't want to protect human beings because he feels that life on Earth has to evolve, and he feels humans are standing in the way of doing that and must wipe out all humans on the planet. The Maximoffs don't yet know his plan until Ultron intends to upload his main his mainframe into another body with the use of the vibranium that he stole, or should I say bought from, essentially, from Ulysses Clow. But because this being has a mind, and it's kind of a being that it is a being that has essentially a conscious brain in a sense, whether it's real or mechanical. Didn't bring my water with me this time, so fuck me. Anyway, because of this, Scarlet Witch is able to read his mind and figures out that, yeah, he wants to destroy all life on the planet, believing that they are the next evolution. That's what Ultron believes, at least. They said, fuck this, we're out of here, and they're able to escape and help out with saving people when Ultron's second skirmish with several members of the Avengers puts people in harm's way. They're able to take the body. They're able to take the body that Ultron was uploading his consciousness in from him, but in return, Ultron kidnaps Black Widow and takes him to Sokovia, where where his final plan is about to be unleashed. Meanwhile, the body is being taken back to Avengers Tower, where Tony, who is able to find Jarvis, has actually survived, and Tony's able to repair him because Jarvis has been constantly changing nuclear missile codes and keeping it away from Ultron, who's been wanting to hack into them. And because they figure out how strong Jarvis actually is in terms of his protocols, Tony and Banner eventually decide that they got to put Jarvis's consciousness into the body. And despite a brief skirmish between the Avengers, Thor comes back with answers and is able to allow the being to come to life. That of course being Vision. Vision comes to life. The Maximoffs join up with the Avengers, and they all band together to destroy Ultron in Sokovia, where he plans to use part of the city like a giant meteorite and destroy all life on the planet and rebuild new with basically his metal brothers that he will eventually build. Through a giant-ass climactic sequence, Ultron is defeated. He's cut off from the web, which means that he won't be able to simply send his subconscious to another body immediately. All of his bodies that created with Ultron's consciousness have to be destroyed, which they are eventually. The meteor-like object is destroyed, and the only casualty in all this is Quicksilver, who dies during the fight trying to protect Hawkeye, who was trying to save a young boy from death, and Quicksilver was the only one who was killed by Ultron. Hulk separates from the Avengers, going on a Quinjet, and stays away from Black Widow, who both Bruce Banner and Black Widow have been slowly growing in a relationship with throughout the film. And of course, Hulk does this to try to stay away from her, so that way she won't be put in harm's way. Thor goes back to Asgard. He reveals that the Mind Stone, in which was used to create Vision, was actually the fourth Mind Stone that's been revealed in the last several years, and that he feels someone has been playing them all for pawns. Of course, the someone that he's referring to inadvertently was Thanos, not knowing yet actually was Thanos. Now, with all that being said, the ending of the film has a new set of Avengers teaming up in order to do their thing. They had Captain America and Black Widow joining up with Vision, Falcon, War Machine, and Scarlet Witch to create the new Avengers team that we would see eventually at the beginning of Captain America Civil War. And a mid-credit scene at the very end of the film shows Thanos, who is growing more and more dissatisfied with the failures of the people in the last several films, dons a gauntlet, a golden gauntlet, and says that he will retrieve the Infinity Stones himself. Basically that's what he vows to himself. Of course, this was a tease that we wouldn't really see come to fruition for another 3 years until Avengers Infinity War. So yeah, a lot to unpack here. There is a lot of repeat from the first film. Some of it's repeat. Other bits are new. What? Okay, it's kind of a weird thing to go into. First of all, I think it's a good film. I know some people might think it sucks. I personally think it's a good film. Is it better than the Avengers? Maybe not, but that's like a barely, slightly kind of thing. It all depends on what taste you're going for. Let's talk about the casting. Casting they're all pretty much on point. All the returning stars from the previous films comes back. Aaron Taylor Johnson and Elizabeth Olsen do great as the Maximoff siblings. Paul Bettany, for the first time, is not just Jarvis, but also has an on-screen appearance as Vision. We even have brief cameos from Haley Atwell, Idris Elba, and even Stellan Skarsgård, who of course played Eric Selvig. And of course Elba, who played Heimdall, and Atwell, who played Peggy Carter previously. And of course Samuel L. Jackson is Nick Fury. Ultron in this film is played by a guy named James Spader, who apparently is an older but very good, well-done actor. And while Ultron isn't the greatest villain in the MCU, I think he's at least a good villain. And James Spader is a big reason why, because one of the things that really saves Ultron from being, kind of a run-of-the-mill villain is James Spader and how believable he is in the role. So you have various, things that are going into this film that work. Now, it's worth mentioning that, now I have to mention this, because I do think Ultron is a good villain. Not a great villain, but he's a pretty good villain. And, but I say good because, on the one hand, there is repeat from the first film. He doesn't see destroying humanity as a bad thing and sees it as cleansing and as a means to rule the Earth in some way, shape, or form, and comes up with some philosophical way in order to explain it. That is basically Loki in a nutshell from the first movie. So while there is that, and that does pull him back from being a great villain, what makes him at least a good villain is another villain Ultron has a relationship with, but not with the MCU. Now you guys might laugh at this. Ultron is basically Sephiroth from Final Fantasy VII. I know, stop laughing. Think about it. So many of the character's traits are there. He starts out as a noble ideal, goes insane when faced with reality, sees human beings as a disease rather than a people to protect, is obsessed with a parent figure, Sephiroth with Genova, Ultron with Tony Stark, tries to find a substance that can be used to great destructive degree, Sephiroth being the black materia which created Meteor, and Ultron with the Vibranium, which he eventually creates a meteor-like object. Of course, both of them want to use meteor-like objects to wipe out all human beings on the planet, or if need be, wipe out the planet itself. Goes on a journey that has the heroes confused and looking inside their heads in order to find out who they truly are. They go on a journey throughout the whole world. He's is responsible for killing one of the heroes of the film at the end. Well, okay, not the ending or FF7, but is responsible for killing one of the heroes when all things are said and done. Ends in a climactic battle where he faces up against all the remaining heroes, and in the end is reduced to a one-on-one duel in which he fights one of the heroes, a duel in which he has absolutely no chance of winning. Yeah, he's Sephiroth. And when I kind of looked into it, I'm like, damn, oh, a lot of Sephiroth comparisons here. And it's like, is that really a bad thing? To be compared to Sephiroth, who is one of the most famous video game villains in all of video game history? I mean, he's not as memorable as, say, someone like Bowser or Ganondorf, but Sephiroth is high up there as one of the great video game villains, and by far one of the great RPG video game villains. I mean, you think video game villains, one of the first things you'd come to mind is Sephiroth, because he's just that iconic of a character ever since he was created back when the game first came out. So when that, and of course both characters have a motif of gray, silver to gray, which I don't know if that means anything, but I just thought that was funny. So yeah, they do have that going for them, which is what makes Ultron a good villain. Granted, he's still taking influence from another villain and not being something completely original, but when you're taking inspiration from someone as complicated a character as Sephiroth, then you have at least the hallmarks of a good villain. But of course, you got the things from the Loki side of things that do kind of hold it back. So you got Ultron, who's a good villain. You have a bunch of other actors who do great in this role, and of course, the plot does more to further the progression of the characters. We look more into Black Widow's past. We see more of Hawkeye's present. We see the budding romance between Bruce Banner and Natasha Romanoff, a romance that you probably have an idea is not going to end the best, but you hope for the best. So at least there's that. You, of course, have the other characters trying to deal with their pasts, and who they are as people, and trying to deal with what's to come in the future. The special effects are great. The action sequences, especially with the Hulkbuster, the final action sequence, the opening sequence, the brief skirmish with the Maximoffs and Ultron, they're all done really well. The chase scene in at near the end of the film before the final battle, that's also done very well. All the action scenes are done, very, very well. Some of them even better than the first Avengers film. The plot, it's kind of a basic plot, similar to the first film, with them having to chase around a villain, trying to figure out his evil plot, and of course the use of various manipulation tactics, much like how Loki was doing. Ultron also manipulated certain people, at one point brainwashing a doctor by the name of Helen Cho, who was known for tissue reinforcement, that helped out Hawkeye very early on in the film. Now, with that being said, there's a lot of really, really good stuff here. Funny lines. You see the Avengers working off each other. There's a lot of good stuff here. A lot of it which we also did see in the first film, which is not a harping on this film, but it does tend to go on repeat. Like I said. A villain that doesn't see destroying everything as a bad thing. Using brainwashing as a means to get what he wants. Trying to turn the Avengers against one another. Which briefly they do until Thor snaps their asses out of it. And so yeah, that does, and that does tend to, you can lose yourself in the fun, but you can't help but feel sometimes, yeah, that's also from the first film. They even use the Loki's scepter to to brainwash someone, that being Dr. Helen Cho. Okay, so that's one thing. What are some other things I wasn't a big fan of? I was not a big fan of two things. There's two things in particular I'm not a big fan of. One of them was how they handled Tony Stark. I gotta admit, sometimes even more so than Iron Man 2, Tony Stark, you're not always behind the character. You like the character because, of course, he's played by Robert Downey Jr., but there's a problem with the character in this film. The fact that he's such a first of all, he falls for the trick that, what he was shown by Wanda Maximoff was actually a vision of the future, and instead inadvertently creates a big evil. First of all, Tony Stark, how does he fall for this? And second off, even if he did, and I'm like, okay, if he did and made up for, and tried to, correct it, that'd be one thing. But initially, he doesn't want to destroy Ultron because, because he feels Ultron is what's needed in order to protect the world. That's one thing. But his attitude towards it is really shitty. Everyone's looking at Tony like, why is he killing us? And Tony's laughing and giggling like a schoolboy. And both Thor and Captain America are like, what the fuck? What's going on? I could see where they were thinking that. And Steve Rogers later in the film makes a very big good point. He said that when someone tries to stop a war before it starts, innocent people die. Of course, he's alluding to Project Insight from Captain America Winter Soldier. If you remember Project Insight, they wanted to stop all terrorism before terrorists could even walk out of their caves or their hideout areas. And S.H.I.E.L.D. wanted basically to protect the planet through fear. And Steve was seemingly the only guy who had a problem with this. Because he feels that by ruling people through intimidation, that's not true freedom. And Nick Fury was trying to justify it. And what happened? It came back to bite them in the ass. Hydra tried to poison it. Hydra came out of hiding and tried to poison it and basically kill not all life on the planet, but try to kill everyone that was in their way of creating a new Hydra world. So if anybody has any room to talk about this sort of thing, it's Steve Rogers, because he just went through this shit a year ago before this film. Now he has to go through it again. He's understandably, especially by someone he supposedly trusts, he's understandably pissed off. And Tony is trying to justify it, and it wasn't until, Nick Fury comes in and finally straightens his ass out, as well as Thor's reinforcement that, yes, in the later situation, Stark was correct. In the second situation, at least when it comes to Vision, he doesn't really, he's still he's still funny, he still does his, fun things, but he's also kind of being a dick about it. It's like, come on, man. You created a great evil. Own up to it. So that I had a big problem with how they, almost in some tiny way, villainized Tony Stark. Not like in Captain America Civil War, where you understood his point of view. In this film, he's kind of being an asshole half the time, kind of like how he was in Iron Man 2. Then, one other thing I had a problem with, and it's the same problem that we've seen in other films before. We saw it in Batman v Superman. We saw it in The Mummy. Way too much advertising for future films. It's okay to briefly advertise a film or throw in a brief, throw in like a brief moment at the end of the film or in the post-credit scene or whatever. But in this movie, God, I already lost my thought. Oh yeah, okay, yeah. They tried to do what Iron Man 2 did, which is build too much on future films. And much like with Iron Man 2, it got in the way. It not in the way too much, not nearly as badly, but it was something that was immediately noticeable. For example, like what I'm talking about, there's a scene in which when Thor breaks out from the Avengers, he comes across Eric Selvig. They both go to like a pond pool together, which apparently has magical properties that only Thor knows about. And going into the pond thing is able to look into glimpses of the future. And because Heimdall, in his vision that Wanda gave him, Heimdall alludes to the fact that all of Asgard is dead. Of course, alluding to the events that would proceed after the events of Thor Ragnarok, and we would see the aftermath of in the beginning of Avengers Age of Ultron, in which most of the Asgardians, as well as Heimdall, is killed. But here, this is 3 years prior to that, though. This is 3 years prior, and Thor also sees a vision of a golden glove with at least 4 of the Infinity Stones, which of course alludes to Avengers Infinity War, in which Thanos has 4 of the stones, in which Thanos at one point for a good chunk of the third act had only 4 of the 6 Infinity Stones, and of course that golden glove was in fact the gauntlet that Eitri the dwarf created for Ultron for Thanos. So yes, there you had kind of a similar thing, kind of like what Batman v Superman did, which was advertising Aquaman, The Flash, Cyborg, and a fucking Injustice storyline where it didn't need to be. Focus on your film. Don't focus on so much on future films, even if it's one scene. Focus on your film and furthering your movie. I mean, granted, he also saw a vision of, well, vision, but still, so much focus was given to that. I'm just like, really, man? Come on. So, yeah, despite my gripes with the film, I still very much enjoyed it. I'm going to give the film an 8 out of 10. If I absolutely had to choose which one was better, I probably would go for the first one, but that's just a barely. I think it's like barely better. Because it had just a 1 or 2 less issues than in this film, which, while it only had a few issues, some of them, to me, were kind of major. And not only that, but both films had their strengths and their weaknesses. The first Avengers films did things better in that film than they did here. In this film, they also did other things better that wasn't as good in the first film, like building upon more about Hawkeye and Black Widow, changing Thor's speech from his old English to regular English. Thor actually was speaking like a normal person, much like how he was in previous films, Avengers aside. So, they did fix a couple issues, but created more of them. With that being said, this film gets an 8 out of 10 from me. Good film. Go check it out. It's a lot of fun. Until next time, guys, I'll see you next time later today when I review the first Ant-Man film starring Paul Rudd. Until next time, guys, be well, stay safe, have a good day, and as always, peace.